What do you do when you are the director of an anatomy school, but there are simply not enough bodies to dissect if you get them the legal way? You just buy them from shady Ressurection men, no questions asked, of course. Welcome to the 4th episode of Fun Facts about Victorian Death and Mourning. I am your host, the Gentle Fae, a PhD student specialising in Victorian death culture. And in this series, I'm sharing some of the dark and macabre things I've learned along the way. In today's episode, we're exploring how a need for having dead bodies to dissect led to body snatching and even murder. The practice of snatching bodies out of graves has a rich history, which dates back to at least the 17th century. The need for grave robbing arose when surgeons realised that they needed to learn more about human anatomy, at a time when dissection was condoned but not exactly encouraged. Up until 752, only 6 bodies of hanged felons per year were turned over for dissection to the College of Surgery, later the Royal College of Surgeons, for public dissection. Public dissection was deemed an extreme punishment because at the time, the majority of the people firmly believed in the second coming of Christ and his resurrecting the dead. Well into the 19th century, people believed that this resurrection was literal bodies rising from the grave, and they feared they could not be resurrected if their bodies were not resting within a grave and had been completely taken apart. However, the 1752 Anatomy Act attempted to make a difference in this, as it no longer limited the number of bodies of executed convicts that could be used for dissection. Instead, the law left it up to the judges to include in their sentence whether or not the body was to be dissected after its execution. Yet, when the number of private anatomy schools rose significantly in the early 19th century, it became very clear that the number of bodies supplied by the gallows did not suffice. In the year 1826, for example, 10 anatomy schools alone were responsible for the dissection of 592 bodies by 701 students. Now we know that there weren't enough executions to make up the number of bodies that were being dissected, so we know they got them from other sources. The need for bodies for dissection actually gave rise to a new profession, that of professional body snatchers, or, as they were also sometimes called, resurrection men. Whilst the public was outraged by the constant stealing of dead bodies out of graves, there was very little they could do about it because it wasn't punishable by law. At the time, the dead bodies were perceived as non-property, which meant that they belonged to no one. This made it impossible to arrest men for having dug up bodies. So the only way to combat body snatching was to take preventative measures. The easiest precaution was to dig deeper graves. However, the problem with this was a lack of space, as burial grounds were severely overcrowded, causing especially the bodies of the poor to be stacked up closely, and often only covered by a light layer of earth. Pauper graves were even left entirely open, so as to make it easier to add fresh bodies to them, making them easy targets for body snatchers. Moreover, the deeper graves were not without risk for the poor gravediggers, as a gravedigger in Glasgow fell into the grave he had dug and would have been buried alive had it not been for some passers-by who rescued him. Slightly safer precautions were posting guards at the graveyard or, for those who could afford it, to place the body within a lead coffin. However, as I explained in my presentation for Iron Mouse, the latter did run the risk of spontaneous combustion, which brought with it its own set of problems. Some people got quite creative in their ideas to combat the resurrection men, by suggesting, for example, pouring acid over the corpse before interment, so it could not be used for dissection. But that also kind of defeated the purpose of not wanting to be dissected in the first place. Another suggestion was booby-trapping the coffin itself by adding, for example, a gunpowder trigger to the lid. Now that would surely be a very nasty surprise for any resurrection man trying to open that coffin. But it wasn't exactly safe. The most effective method, however, was the most mundane. Apparently mixing the soil with straw and stones made digging sufficiently hard for the body snatchers to give up before getting to the coffin. In 1828, however, it became clear that some men who sold corpses to anatomy schools had not exactly been waiting patiently for the people to die on their own, so they could later dig up their bodies, but had simply decided to help things along a little bit. I am, of course, talking about the infamous men Burke and Hare. It all started when they sold the body of an old man that died owing money in Mrs. Hare's cheap boarding house to an anatomical school to cover the debt. They were paid £7 and 10 shillings for the body, which was a substantial amount. To put it into perspective, the daily wage of a day labourer in London was 3 shillings and 4 pence, meaning that in one day they earned almost 30 times that. The men clearly saw this as their get-rich-quick scheme, as not long after they put a sickly tenant into a stupor by feeding him copious amounts of liquor, after which they smothered him with a pillow. This time they were paid £10 for the body. They continued on with their lucrative trade, killing a total of 15 people, 12 women, 2 handicapped youths, and an old man, before their method of acquisition was uncovered. Their crime came to light after they murdered the unfortunate Mary Doherty, who had come to Edinburgh in search of a long-lost son. Burke had stumbled across the unfortunate woman when she was begging on the streets and invited her to stay with him and his wife in their lodgings. At the time, the Burkes were sharing a room with a soldier named Gray and his wife. The Burkes asked them to spend the night in the room of Burke's brother, under the premise that they would be entertaining family that night. When the subsequent day Burke told Mrs. Gray not to go near a pile of straw in the room, she got suspicious and went to investigate as soon as he left the house. Underneath the straw, she discovered the dead body of poor Mary Doherty. Mrs. Hare did attempt to buy their silence, but the Greys decided to alert the authorities instead. For those wondering if the surgeons that bought the bodies knew of their doubtful origin, we actually know that the surgeon who bought the bodies from Burke and Hare, Dr. Knox, did. The doctor's 3 assistants offered a statement after the arrest of Burke and Hare, in which they explained how they had recognized one of the bodies the men had brought in as that of Daft Jamie, a mentally and physically handicapped 18-year-old boy that was a well-known public figure in Edinburgh. The 3 men explained how they had recognized Jamie not just by his face, but also his deformed foot. When the boy's mother began to search for him, Knox broke his usual protocol of having the oldest acquired body be dissected first, and proceeded to have his 3 assistants remove the face and feet of the body of Jamie. So they definitely were not innocent. It was not until 1832 that the authorities attempted to put a stop to the body snatching by passing a law that put the bodies of unclaimed paupers up for dissection as well. The poor were of course outraged, not only because they were essentially given the same treatment as convicted felons, but they also believed, as I explained earlier, that it would prevent them from eventually being resurrected and entering God's new kingdom on earth. However, the measure did prove moderately successful, and the occupation of resurrection men slowly died out. It is about time for me to leave you again. I trust that you've enjoyed our trip down the history of body snatching, and that you will look forward to our next episode, in which we will stay within the realm of Victorian graveyards, as we talk about the dark truths that instigated burial reform, as well as about London's Necropolis Railway, the underground railway for the dead. Until next time, and as always, stay comfy and spooky, my friends.